Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Good. So, right, Sean. So we've just got you so far, although we may have other people tuning in. So yeah, did you have a chance to, and it's okay if you didn't, do you have a chance to look at any of the content at the end of this chapter? I think it's chapter 10 on Immanuel Kant and thinking about the value of life and so forth.
Yeah,
That's
I
okay if you,
read chapter 10. I didn't like look anything up content
yeah,
wise, but
yeah. Yeah. So what did it make you think of? What were any contrasts you might have noticed between that and some of the other things we had been chatting about in the class?
mm, well, I found it a little scary, just because we were looking at like it's actually like a very good time to cover like the respect for persons. Yesterday in one of my Asian theology classes, we were covering like pandemics in a religiously complex world, and we were looking at who gets treatment, like who is worthy of treatment, is like do you value one person over another. And
Mm,
we were looking at like governor of Texas saying he would die in order to continue the economy like at a strong
oh,
state that it is
mm,
for his children. Like he said he was willing to sacrifice his life. And
mm,
then you have like Andrew Cuomo being like public health is way more important than the
mm,
economy. Like,
yeah.
so it was interesting to see like the values on human life and how, like who actually has the respect that you would think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. There are a number of people who point out that that Kantian thinking, there are some ways in which it's actually fairly, you might say, impractical, because he's not really concerned about, the consequences. So if the consequence is, if the effect of a certain course of action is the economy completely tanks irreparably, and we enter kind of a new, like, dark age or something like that, that's the consequence. That's actually immaterial for Kantian thinking, because he's basing his ethics on whether you are fulfilling your duty and respecting the dignity of another human being. Of course, a lot of people will point out, well, if you spoil the economy and wreck things so that even if there is another pandemic, we can't recover, isn't that also kind of undermining people's dignity? But we run into similar challenges there too, because there's so much about the future that we don't know, right? So it's possible, right? And again, I keep harkening back to the that line from Frozen 2, right? When you can't see the future, you do, and which is often the case, then you do the next right thing, right? So we don't know what exactly is going to happen. We don't know the consequences. So all we have to do is just focus on our duties, right? And I'm sorry, I don't want to talk too long. Welcome, Anna. Um, Yeah. So, um, I don't know. Do you think that there is some merit to Kantian thinking, uh, considering there's not much of a regard or respect for the outcomes of certain actions?
I think if you put aside the fact that like it's duty based, because it's very hard to stick with a duty based moral theory just because you can think of so many consequences that are so negative that if you choose to follow like your principles that could happen. So I think it's very easy to come up with all these solutions, but if you just look at it like kind of ignoring that fact, I think there is a little bit of value to the way Kant views human life. He does think it's like of the utmost important, and his like view on justice is it's a pretty like American view of justice. It's like equal, like an eye for an
Yeah.
eye type of
Yeah.
justice. Like that's what he supports. Like he only believes that the punishment for someone should be equal to what their crime is. So that like there is merit there, but it's very hard to take it very seriously because it's duty based, not consequence based.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So, yeah, what do we think is some, or how do we understand the basis or the justification for that kind of policy for punishment, the sort of retributivist way of thinking about it, the idea that punishment, the purpose of punishment is to, in a sense, get back at the person for committing the crime or performing the action. Um, Kant, what he does, the part of his reasoning is that, um, so we imagine a situation where somebody commits a murder, and then we punish the person, but then we nevertheless, in our punishment, allow the person to continue to live, whereas the person he killed doesn't obviously get to live, right? So uh, Kant would point out that what basically we're stating, and of course Kant was a huge fan. This is something we talked about last week, of thinking about what our actions imply or what our actions state morally. So we're basically stating, if somebody commits murder and then, well, we punish the person, but we still let that person live, then we are basically stating with that kind of policy that murder is somehow, at least to some extent, acceptable, right? We're saying that it's tolerable to an extent that somebody who is the murderer's life actually becomes, through that transaction, more valuable than the person he murdered, right? So because the murderer gets to continue to live, but the victim does not, right? So we would be stating with that policy that we 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 respect the murderer more than the victim, right? Yeah. What do we think of that? Does that seem like it would be a kind of a solid case for capital punishment at every point when somebody commits a murder? So should everybody who commits a murder be murdered, as Kant suggests? Not, well, be executed, I guess, as Kant suggests, or um, is Kant's consistency here another case where we might think that Kantianism might be a little bit too much?
I think I personally would side more with like Bentham on the theory of like punishment, and like I think you should really actually try and be like rehabilitating. Like, what's the point of? Granted, like murder is very different when you get to like very harsh crimes like rape, murder, along those lines. It's very hard for
Yeah.
rehabilitation and to feel comfortable with that. But I think what's the point of just leaving someone in a cell to rot compared to rehabilitating them and maybe getting them prepared to actually rejoin society instead of you know leaving them in the cell, having them get out and then going, oh, I have no money, I have a lot of bills to pay, what am I going to do? I'm going to do what I know how to get quick money. I'm going to go back to stealing, robbing. So like I think you should focus on rehabilitation, but that is regardless. I think that like that completely neglects the Kant's view, neglects the situation and context of things. Like, now are you saying like if you murder out of self-defense, do you deserve to die? Like, if you need to be consistent and like hold through, like then there's a big issue right away.
Yeah.
Yeah, like what if it was an accident with the killing? Like, would you have to be killed too in order to like say it was like car accident or
Yeah.
something like that? Like, so that would mean that you would be killed too, correct?
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think in Kant's defense, right? So in that case, it there was not the intention of killing somebody, right? So yeah, I think that might be an area where Kant would say, well, no, in that case, you didn't. So again, with if we maintain the Kantian idea, I mean, Anna, that's a really good that's a really good point, right? So if we maintain the Kantian idea that an action implies a maxim, like an action is basically giving permission. Well, that that also does require that the action was intentional, right? So otherwise, we would create a moral framework every time we made a mistake, right? So and I think that's not what Kant necessarily is going for, in a sense. And I think we could be slightly relieved that I think an accidental killing doesn't necessarily constitute murder, and it doesn't necessarily justify murder. And maybe a lot of people would say it doesn't really qualify technically as murder, because murder really is the deliberate killing. I guess that's one of the reasons why in law we would say, well, we, as if I'm not a legal expert, but people would refer to, and we've talked about this a little bit in class before as well, like accidental manslaughter, or sorry, or involuntary manslaughter or something like that. So, and not necessarily murder, but yeah, you killed somebody, maybe you did it accidentally. So some people would say that there's still some kind of crime there because there maybe somebody was negligent, or maybe somebody was, irresponsible in some way that led to the death of somebody else, and so forth. And those might be other kinds of moral wrongs, we could say, negligence or so forth.
So
But
like,
it's not necessarily like murder.
sorry, what was be like his viewpoint on that? Like, 'cause, like when it's involuntary manslaughter, they still get punishment for it, like in our courts. So like, what would be his viewpoint on that? Like, if it was accidental,
Oh yeah.
or like, would he
Um,
think there'd be any punishment, or would it just be?
yeah. Yeah, an accident or a mistake um, itself doesn't really make a moral claim, right? So let's say I well, I don't know, we just adopted a couple cats last week, right? So let's say, and they're both black. At least most of them are black. One of them is like a tuxedo cat, so forth. So let's say I let's say it's really dark and it's really tired. I'm really tired. It's in the middle of the night, and I accidentally step on one of the cat's tails and say, maybe, I don't know, break one of the bones in its tail. I'm not sure, right? Which, if I had done that intentionally, that absolutely would constitute assault, right? And in a sense, or if I did that to a human being on accident, if I accidentally bumped into somebody, let's say I was just walking down the street and just accidentally knocked somebody. Gosh, I hope this never happens, but every once in a while, it's a complete mistake. I accidentally knocked somebody into the street just enough for them to get hit by a car and they die, right? Um, Complete mistake. And so because I didn't intend to do it, then I'm not really making any kind of moral claim with that action, because it wasn't something that it doesn't represent my will, as it were. Um, does that seem like a fair defense of Kant there, or might I be missing something about Kant? Because just to kind of check myself about that. Let me
It's a fair defense for Kant, but I would still, I don't think he's right. Like
think.
it's a good defending, but there's still many issues with Kantian thinking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, fair enough. Go
is it
ahead.
true? Like, do we pick the pieces of Kant that we like from his moral theories and ignore the fact, like, isn't he? I just remember another theology teacher saying, like, he prefaced his Kant lecture with, like, look, Kant's a bigot. He's a racist, but he has a good insight on, and we were covering evil. He has good insight on good and evil, and like that's why we covered him.
Hmm. Yeah. What do you think, Anna, in response to Sean's point? Is Kant just a
Yeah, I think so too. That like I think some of his viewpoints are a little out there.
yeah.
Like, I think the same way. Where like he does have some good insight on like what's really bad and what's good, and like it really made me think a lot too
Yeah.
while like going through it.
Hmm. Yeah, and so, oh yeah, that's right. Wanted to mention earlier, Sean, something that actually both of you had sort of touched on with respect to punishment or retribution, is that there are some crimes where the retribution for them, or the response to them, or if we were to say that there needs to be an equal punishment that fits the crime in a kind of one-to-one proportion, there are some crimes where um, not only would we be kind of unable to serve the punishment, but probably we wouldn't want to serve the punishment, right? So if you mentioned like sexual assault, right? What would be the response to that? How do you manage that punishment, right? In a purely strictly Kantian sense, right? So yeah, there are certainly a lot of areas where it's impractical. There, of course, as you mentioned, so there is some there are some good aspects of Kantian thinking too. We mentioned last week about how some of Kant's ideas are a little bit similar to a couple of maybe intuitive items from maybe common sense that a lot of us maintain. One of which is following the golden rule: treat other people the way that you would want to be treated, right? Which is very similar to, in a sense, what Kant did was he took something like that idea and gave lots of logical and moral philosophical justification to the golden rule. And then also, something that we oftentimes oppose is hypocrisy, right? When somebody treats somebody a certain way, but then opposes it but then opposes it when somebody else does the same, right? So yeah, for the golden rule and for our opposition to hypocrisy, Kant absolutely adds some heavy weight to that and gives us a lot of really good reasons to continue to follow those principles. But yeah, absolutely. If somebody were kind of entirely, totally sold out, 100% committed Kantian, yeah, would that person be, very difficult to get along with? Would that person make decisions that are the best for a society, right? And could you, you know, could you share a coffee with this person without getting completely annoyed? I don't know, right? So, but yeah, you're right to say that it seems as though there's a lot that's maybe kind of rude and blunt and maybe even bigoted, right? With well, the Kant himself, right, as a person, but also to some extent his philosophy. Yeah. So this touches on something else that I think is worth maybe mentioning here, maybe at this point in the course, and especially as as you all are starting to draw from multiple sources and starting to compare some of these moral theories to some amount of depth. Earlier, Sean was mentioning um, Jeremy Bentham and what his approach to punishment would be or should have been or was and should be perhaps about deterrence or reform rather than retribution, right? So one of the things that we can do is notice, as I think a lot of you have, is that it's very rare, maybe impossible to be a complete purist with respect to the moral theory that a person has. It's I'm not sure that it's ever been successfully done for somebody just to have one moral theory with very well-defined borders and no space for overlap with other moral theories, right? I'm not sure that that's ever really been done. Um, and I mean, in a sense, I'm relieved about that because that means that I feel less pressure to say I am, this kind of moral thinker. I feel less pressure to say that, but at the same time, I feel a little bit apprehensive about it because that means that I'm opening myself up to something that we're supposed to avoid with all of our might in philosophy, which is inconsistency or contradiction, right? So, in as much as I say, well, I'll take a little bit of Kant and a little bit of Mill and maybe a little bit of Locke and you know so forth, am I just playing salad bar with all these moral theories until it's no longer a coherent theory, right? Am I risking that by um, by by trying to merge the best of some theories?
I don't think you are. Like, the thing with moral theories is that if you have a set, like, this is what I'll do in this situation, it's never going to work out like that because there's so many different dynamics going at play in that situation that you can't really just, like, if it's duty based, you have your principles, they may never, there probably won't be consistency because of the situation you're in, or like because of the relationships you have in that situation. And like, it's there's too much going on. Reality is too complex for you to just kind of say, this is what I do, So like, I think like just to follow a certain moral code would be, ignoring the reality of the situation and what's actually going on. You have to take everything into consideration and then make the best decision. But if you ignore that and just follow your moral code, you're gonna end up probably, losing a lot of good relationships, etc., you could really mess up your life.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a really good point.
I think also like back to like the train scenario too, about how like we all think like, yeah, obviously like murdering's bad, but like how quickly in a situation like that could change. And also like the prisoner's dilemma we talked about, just like how we all think we have a set of moral codes, but how easy we can get like off track and like change.
Yeah.
Yeah, like what really is the difference between like killing, letting die, you know, like it's very tricky.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Very well put. I get you're really coming to appreciate kind of the depth and the nuance of some of these tricky decisions, right? And then all the different factors that play a role in them, right? Yeah. There's one thinker who that is maybe worth considering here, but I think we're going to spend. I think the text has us looking at him to a little bit more depth a little bit later on, if it didn't already mention him. But there's somebody called W.D. Ross who developed what he called prima facie obligations, and we have talked a little bit about that in the course already. So prima facie meaning first at first look or first face, right? Um, Basically the your default position, as it were, but just your default, and it without necessary consideration of uh, without consideration of many different details or many specific aspects of every given situation. We can't possibly consider that, as you rightly mentioned. So what Ross considers these kind of moral principles that we're looking at, like Kant's means end principle. Oh, gotta make sure that we talk more about that, because we didn't get to chat about it on Tuesday. What Ross is saying is that what we're doing when we're examining these principles and these theories is we're looking at basically what our default position is, what the first glance moral principles that we might follow are, you know, all other things being equal, right? And ceteris paribus, right? Everything else is generally the same. How then do we approach it? But what Ross also recognizes is that there are some places where there are significant moral conflicts, and then what we end up doing, as I think you all are mentioning, is we end up kind of like doing a bit of weighing and balancing of our values, right? So is that ordinarily we would, let's say this utilitarian idea that you you might well, sacrifice one person in order to save several more people. We might say that we won't do that. We won't do that without somebody's willingness when there's only a few people to be saved. But let's say it's a choice between, say, just going ahead and murdering one person in order to save, millions of people, right? Then is it okay to violate the dignity of that one person? And so, and the numbers game sometimes may affect things. Of course, Kant would say, still, even in that case, when you're trying to save a million people, it's still wrong to murder one person, even if that's the only way to save a million people. It's still wrong to do that because it violates the person's dignity as a human, and basically you're giving everybody else permission to kill me too. All right, so there, yeah, so there's a little bit of weighing. We might consider it when the numbers change or when the consequences change. So yeah, Ross is saying, well, okay, but before that situation, before we look at that specific detail, well, you have a basic, your basic principles are, X, Y, and Z. Don't be a hypocrite. Treat the people the way you want to be treated. Maximize the good. We can blend as many different moral theories as we want and say that these are prima facie obligations. But then when the context changes, then we have to do some weighing and balancing, which of course is subjective and may lead to some inconsistencies, but nevertheless, it's a much more kind of practical and workable and livable, applicable way to make decisions morally. Yeah. And any responses? I'm going to mention a couple more things, but yeah, any reactions to that, to the idea of like weighing and balancing moral theories or principles?
I think that's a good way to go about it. I think looking at moral theories and seeing what points they bring up, it's very important to recognize that and, take that into consideration when like making decisions. Like, to think about the suffering for, like, say, utilitarianism, the pleasure versus suffering. I think that's important, but it shouldn't be the deciding factor. Like, it's very important to take all of them into consideration and know as much as you can. But at the end of the day, you just, what was the Frozen 2 line again? Like, you got to
Right.
do
Do the next right thing. Yeah.
Yeah, next right thing that you personally think is the next right thing.
Yeah.
And I think no one could be upset with someone who made a decision if they completely looked at all the moral theories, weighed, like, balanced it, and then made the decision that they thought is right. Like, I think someone could say they disagreed with it, but you can't get mad at someone if they weighed all the options.
Yeah, I think it's really well put. Yeah. Yeah, really good.
And I also think when we're talking about like the difference between like killing one person and letting a couple live, I found like the most interesting like thought experiment with that was how easily we were like, yes, it's okay to kill the one person to save the five. A couple people would say, but though, like, I think I was okay with letting one person die in order to save five. But as soon as you flip the situation to a healthy person walks into a hospital with like the vital organs that five people need, is it okay to kill them? Like, that was like,
Right.
okay, wait a second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I also think like, you could ask the person, it's not like this person is not considerate of that. Like, if someone told me that if you die, 1,000,000 people will live, I'd probably let them kill me. Like, I'm not saying for sure, I'd have to know who's living, but
Yeah.
like, I feel like if someone came up to you and was like, look, these 1,000,000 people are going to die. I don't know what situation that would happen in, but they're like, they'll die if you don't die. And I'd be like, okay, like, I that's a good way to go out. I'm
Mhm.
going to die someday.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. Or the soldier, throwing his body on a grenade that was just tossed into a room or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. Some people do make those um, usually like supererogatory or like an additional sacrifices for other people's sake, right? Oh, Sam, were you gonna say that? I don't know if Sam has been wanting to chime in here, but I see that you muted yourself. So anyway, okay, it's just that you're popping up on the screen. Yeah. So right. So in those cases, probably the only person that, or the only sort of moral theorist that might have a problem with self-sacrifice might be egoists, right? They might say that you're doing wrong to yourself, right, by sacrificing your life on behalf of other people. Maybe. Although some egoists might say, well, it's your life, you can do whatever you want with it, and so forth, right?
Yeah. To
That sounds a
offer
little bit more subjectivist. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, to offer like another defense of like egoism, you could also say like, that is in my best interest to sacrifice myself and create a long-lasting legacy that I might not have had otherwise. Like, like, I'm
Sure.
sure it's not like I remember I was just watching like 1917, and in it the two soldiers have to go like save the brother. And the one soldier says to the other, he goes, well, like, done and set, you'll get your medal now. Like, your legacy's preserved,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. For better or worse, I guess, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Especially so, while we're still alive, a lot of the time, egoists would say, "Well, I'm going to be charitable. I'm going to be generous to other people because I want them to respect me, and I want them to enjoy their time with me. I want to enjoy my time with them, and so forth." So, egoists may very well be very good-natured people, even if the ultimate goal of that for egoists is to maximize their own happiness. And you could say that it would give, if they know that they're going to die eventually, well, then it'll give them some kind of comfort as they approach their eventual death to know that, as you say, their legacy will be preserved in some way after they die. All right. Yeah.
And
So, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say, how does that is there any egoists who can fall under that golden rule principle that we were talking about with uh, I think it was Kant's, um, the golden rule of kind of not being a hypocrite, and
Yeah.
being an egoist. So you would act in, your own self-interest, just so far as the way you were acting is how you'd want everyone else to treat you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. That comes very close to, and probably I think that what you've just formulated is, I mean, effectively, maybe I'm making a mistake here, but I don't think so, is effectively identical to Ayn Rand's point when she says, and probably the central commitment that defines her version of egoism, and really she's probably the most well-known proponent of egoism in the 20th century. Her major line is, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't know the exact quote, but basically says, I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of any man, nor will I ask any man to live for my sake, right, or to live on my behalf. So it's very reciprocal, just like you're describing, Sam. It's intended not to be hypocritical because I'm not going to be anybody else's servant. I'm not going to live my life on on behalf of anybody else, but I also won't expect anybody else to live their life on my behalf. Everybody should be in it for themselves. And of course, Ayn Rand's understanding is when we're all in it for ourselves, well, we're going to end up, when we need things from other people, we're going to end up having to respect and treat those other people graciously enough that they will supply what we need, whether that need is emotional or whether it's physical or nutritional or resources and so forth. So yeah, there is a way in which you can see some overlapping between the golden rule and egoism. Yeah, well spotted, Sam. Yeah, yeah. Any follow up on that? Does that trigger any additional thoughts about how the golden rule can be, or the idea not to be a hypocrite can be, in a sense, compatible with egoism?
I would say I just finished reading The Worldly Philosopher, which is about kind of the economic thinkers from Smith to Keynes. And most of the kind of variation in all of their thinking is because most of them are kind of in that Keynes or on the Smith egoism. This is how a society operates. But a lot of them find that humans do not act in that kind of egoistic, I'm trying to optimize my life to, optimize my life so that society will be optimized because I'm doing everything in my own interest. And if you do everything in your interest, will, both come out better and will make society better. Obviously, there have been most of the economic thinkers kind of found holes in that logic and found that that's not how most people in the world operate.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a really good point too, especially when we consider, yeah, gosh, a couple things. There are lots of threads we could follow based on these comments that you and Sean and Anna have been making. One of them is that one of the things that people are noticing at all levels. Well, first of all, one thing that might be worth noting is that there are some kind of curricula, some sort of degree programs. I don't think that John Carroll University has one such program, but nevertheless, it's very common for there to be some sort of program in sometimes what's called PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, right? So, because these three ideas oftentimes are interwoven in the way we try to solve problems in in society, right? So, anyway, just to point that out, that yeah, absolutely, there's a lot of overlap between those topics, politics, philosophy, and economics. Well, the other thing that also I think is worth mentioning is that people have been noticing that some earlier economic theories and some earlier probably philosophical theories too. Not probably, I don't know why I keep on qualifying myself, but a lot of the time they're based on some assumptions about human nature, right? Again, I qualified it. A lot of the time, they're always, I should say, based on assumptions about human nature. And some of those assumptions, among one of those assumptions, is that we have a general understanding of how our minds work, or when we're making economic decisions out of our own self-interest, that we will make the most rational decision for our own self-interest. Turns out that that's not true, right? There are sometimes we make rational decisions for our own self-interest, but much of the time we make very kind of irrational decisions, um, thinking that it's going to benefit us the most or more than anything else, thinking that, but actually getting that wrong, right? A lot of our decisions don't actually maximize the good for ourselves. And rational choice economics has made that false assumption oftentimes. And there are very good economic models that are based on rational choice theory. However, a much, much more accurate model would include the fact that human beings are, we can be persuaded. We actually are very, very emotional creatures. And we are not computers, right? So we are full of biases, right? Cognitive biases and emotional biases and so forth.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's a very important point. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
I know. I think you're touching kind of on the field of behavioral economics, which is kind of what got me interested in economics, and
Definitely.
the kind of the current kind of forebearer of behavioral economic thought, actually the Case Western Reserve graduate Richard Thaler, and he describes that kind of rational person as kind of homo economist, which is what all the models are based off of someone who makes purely rational decisions, kind of a pure egoist. And but all humans are homo sapiens. We're not inherently rational. We don't behave like the models suggest all the time. So that's kind of psychology in psychology's emergence into economics through behavioral economics is sounds a lot like what you're describing.
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly what I'm describing. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it was Thaler too, wasn't it? Who one of his texts is simply called Nudge, isn't it? Or was that somebody
Yes.
else?
Yeah, he
Thaler, yeah.
wrote Nudge and
Yeah.
then Misbehaving, which
Yeah. Okay, so in nudge theory, which sometimes has been referred to as like libertarian paternalism, which seems like a contradiction, because the idea is that you want people to be as free as possible. You want them to make their own choices. You don't want to force them into anything. However, you will paternalistically, in other words, kind of like a parent, you will frame the options that they are freely making in such a way that they are more likely to make a better choice for themselves and for society writ large. Right? So, and actually, this is great. I'm glad this comes up too, because this is a way for us to kind of circle back and revisit another element of Kant's thinking, which has kind of been in the backdrop of a lot of what we've been talking about, which is, and this will, in a sense, this will sound like just a repetition of other Kantian principles, but one of his principles is called the means end principle, right? The idea that you should never use somebody as a means to an end. Basically because, for lack of another way of putting it, if I treat somebody as an instrument to get something else, if I'm using a human to get some sort of object, then because the human was the means and the object was the goal, I'm effectively stating with that action that the object I've acquired is more valuable than the human being that I used in order to get it. Right? So if I use somebody as a means, as a tool to get what I want, then what I want becomes more valuable than the human. And Kant says, of course, that's a direct violation of human dignity. Human beings are always infinitely more valuable than any object, right? So I can never ethically use somebody in order to get something else, right? Use somebody as an instrument. Things and objects, and Kant would also include animals in this, although I think there are problems with that, of course, naturally. But Kant would say that objects have instrumental value, humans have intrinsic value. We have inherent value. We are of maximal value. And so we don't really talk so much about value with humans. We talk about dignity. I'm sorry, did I hear you chime in?
Yeah, isn't Kant operating on the base assumption though that humans are special, and that
Yeah.
so it's well before Darwin comes out with the theory of evolution, correct?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah,
about half
so
a
he's
century
operating on the base assumption, I'm assuming a
more.
Christian assumption. That's a very big assumption that like God created humans as special and that they reign over all others. But I think that like it was completely changed with the origin of species by Darwin, and now you're looking at a framework from which humans aren't special. We all came from single cell organisms on Earth like 4 point something billion years ago. Like I don't know the exact
Yeah.
dates, but
Well,
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
well, no, I would say even kind of post Darwin, I think when you're talking about humans, we are the only species on Earth that kind of has an argument to say we have gone past evolution. We are now in a kind of a post-evolution phase where we're not, solely on this Earth to repopulate and get bigger, faster, and stronger, beat a natural predator, since there are no natural predators for humans kind of on Earth at the current moment.
Mm.
that is true. You could use evolution as like a support for human supremacy.
Yeah, there are some utilitarians like somebody named Peter Singer who would consider speciesism, the idea that we should be privileged as a species, or that we are superior as a species and therefore have more rights than other species. He would consider that morally wrong because, as a utilitarian, following in Bentham's tradition, thinks that animal suffering is very, very important to consider morally. Right? If animals can suffer similarly as we do, then we need to include them in our circle of moral consideration. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah. So yeah, but just to go back a couple threads. Yeah, these are really helpful points to make. Interesting enough, I think that in bringing up how Kant works out the uniqueness of humans, how he justifies that, he doesn't actually use, even though he, of course, is steeped in a Christian tradition. He's in Europe in the 18th century and stuff like that. Sure, but at the same time, his justification for the uniqueness of humanity doesn't over animals doesn't come from Christian origins. He wants to try to do it as again as logically as possible, but the way he does it, and here's where Sean, you locate another chink in Kant's philosophical armor, because what Kant says is that what makes us unique among animals over animals is the fact that we human beings are rational moral agents, right? So the fact that we are rational agents, and the fact that we are able to come up with a logically consistent moral framework, that's what makes us unique over the animals. The fact that we are able to do that, right? We are rational moral agents. But problems arise immediately because, as we were just talking about, whether we want to approach this theologically or whether we want to approach this like evolutionarily, or if that's even a word, or if we think about the evolution of mind or the human instincts and so forth, what we have been kind of cultivated by natural selection to do. Either way, we really aren't quite so rational, right? We're not really the rational moral agents that Kant thought we are, at least not. So that's one problem. We're not really rational enough to qualify really for Kant's human dignity criteria, right? Criterion. Also, where does that leave children who might not necessarily be fully rational moral agents? They're not fully cooked yet. Of course, there are ways of considering that, right? But aren't they human? But aren't there some humans who are not rational moral agents? And is the fact that they are not rational moral agents, does that then demote them? Do they not have as much dignity or as much value as other humans who are rational moral agents? So, and I think a lot of us would say, no, somebody who let's say somebody has a problem with their brain that prevents them from thinking reasonably and morally in some cases, and there are ways in which people's brains can be damaged such that no longer they no longer have the character or personality that they had before, where they and no longer really care about the well-being of other people and so forth, right? So are those people less valuable then, right? according to Kant's criteria, then maybe they would be less valuable. And that's certainly a problem that makes Kant's thinking a little bit less consistent. Yeah, any follow-up on there? Sorry about that, because that wasn't really a question. That was just sort of me kind of like unpacking an idea, right? Yeah.
I think the thought experiment that really got me to think about like human rationality, like over kind of animals, like being better than animals, was like someone presented the question, which life is more valuable? That a man that is a drunk that abuses his wife and children, or a service dog that provides emotional support to cancer patients and veterans? Like, which life is more important, you know? Is it a human life or a dog's life? And that like really made me think. I was like, honestly, the dog. Like, this man beats his wife, beats his children as a drunk, compared to a dog that has provided support and helped so many people get on with their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So like that kind of brings in like the situation and the context is always going to be important. So I think you could, no matter what, find cases where like an animal seems more rational than a human, and then vice versa, of course. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like,
Well, I would say when you're talking about like animals that have been trained, you're starting to get into kind of a very, you're starting to put, I think, a value on human life, because that animal was trained with X amount of dollars to get it to the state it was. And if it hadn't, it would just be a kind of normal, lapdog, which, I mean, if the case you're making is just kind of a normal dog that's, subservient to a family and, all right and kind, is more valuable than the drunkard who, abuses his wife and is kind of a total net negative on society. But like when you're talking about trained animals, you're kind of looking at that as that's something kind of purely economic, because any animal kind of has the ability to be trained and to do that job. So it's just the actual training and money that was put into that animal to get to the point where it can be a service dog, and that can help the cancer patients and help the blind. And then that's putting a value on that human life of the drunkard.
Like, wouldn't it still be, you would still put in less money, I feel like, to training that dog than the money that was probably put into that human's life in order to get him to the point where he's at. But I'm not big on economic moral theory. Like, I don't know much about it. So that's your field.
Yeah, I just know kind of the general expense of training a dog to be kind of at one of those is very high. And I don't know about obviously the drunkard, but I'm just trying this animal's life that, the only difference between that animal and kind of, a random, wolf is, we put money into it. So this man's life is worth less than the money we put into this dog, which is what kind of how I think one could interpret that. I think the general notion that a dog who's a net, positive on society is better than someone who is, obviously a net negative I think that is true, but just kind of play devil's advocate of making it an entirely monetary thing.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Yeah, this conversation reminds me a little bit about the decisions that are being made, kind of in real time as we speak about the length that we will go to preserve or protect human life. Sometimes when it, right now the economy is a wreck, and but one of the reasons why is because we are taking all of these extensive and unusual measures to prevent the hospitals from being too overwhelmed and prevent a lot of people from dying from complications due to a virus that has a unusually high mortality rate and is pretty contagious and so forth. So this might be one of the concerns that we have. It is one of the concerns that we have, is how much economic damage is it okay to take in order to protect human lives? Or is there a point where, because in a sense, we're making a lot of decisions that you could say are, kind of tilt in a Kantian direction, because we're saying, well, these human beings' lives are valuable, and we will spare no expense to make sure that as many people stay alive as possible, right? Well, if that's kind of Kantian thinking, because, well, the consequences are a wrecked economy, and who knows, maybe the consequences are that with a wrecked economy, we lose some of our safety net in other areas, and people end up dying anyway, as a result of our economy having gone south. Who knows? But the Kantian thinking is that, well, that's a consequence that we are not necessarily going to even consider morally, because our moral obligation, our duty, is to saving these human beings' lives, right? But there does need to be a point, and a lot of people have been pointing this out, and this is an area I usually don't don't agree with some with the president, but he has made a decent point recently. Other people have made this point too, that we can't do this for forever, right? And of course, nobody's saying that we're going to do it forever, but there does need to be a point where we start to think really hard about how much we will let the economy um, uh, shrink in order to save many lives, right? Yeah. So where are you all at that? And I'm sorry, because I haven't really necessarily given my view on that, and so I guess it's a little bit unfair. But yeah, where are you in that in those considerations and in that thinking?
I think.
Yeah. I'll just say, kind of, this is one realm where I think kind of economics is not, shockingly from me, I think economics is not one of the most important things when considering this. I think the mental health aspects are somewhat are going to be attributed to the economy, but also just the isolation are important to think about in kind of way in this when you're talking about the kind of human lives saved, is the mental health costs you're incurring because of this.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and Trump's got his famous line, "We cannot let the cure be worse than the virus itself," or like the cause itself. I found that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think Trump has gone around the pandemic situation all wrong. I think I could talk about it for an hour. Just it's very sad, because you had someone weeks ago saying it's not an issue, we're on top of it, we're ready for it, and then now we're here. Now
Yeah.
It was handled so improperly from my point of view. I was following news coverage because I was supposed to study abroad, so I was following a lot of international news coverage to see how the situation was going, and I kept seeing a lot of articles saying the U.S. is not ready. The U.S. it will get hit hard, and it seemed like he didn't care. And then you have him probably a week ago saying, "I knew this was a pandemic long before it was a pandemic."
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very bothersome to me, because that's just, it's not true. It's like he's lying to the American people and then calling it the China virus, the Wuhan virus. I get the reasoning behind it, because supposedly China's telling its citizens that it came from the US, but the focus shouldn't be on the economy. The focus should be on the American citizens. And I think what Obama said yesterday, that the voters should demand more, is very accurate, not just from Trump, but from the government.
Yeah. Any response to what Sean is pointing out?
Yeah, I would say there was a lot of mishandling from what I've seen, kind of on the front end of the way the CDC and the FDA handled this at the very beginning in terms of testing, and seeing where countries that did handle testing well, in like South Korea and some of the more East Asian countries, that kind of saw what was coming, got everything prepared. They're not in as much of a kind of total lockdown, total shutdown as a lot of the European countries, specifically the Mediterranean countries are. So I think that point is very accurate.
Yeah. Oh shoot, I was gonna point something out, and I forgot what it was. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah. Oh, about the messaging and the pandemic and decisions made. Oh yeah. I remember. I'm sorry. So yeah, I was going to point out that it's there. It's interesting how some have been pointing out that it's too much of a partisan issue. And of course, early on, one of the ways in which Trump was downplaying the virus was by calling the threat from the virus a Democratic hoax or a hoax from the Democrats and things like that. So, of course, that was certainly a misstep and all the delays. But what's interesting is that it's not in a sense there are lots of Ohioans who are very relieved that our governor has been taking such aggressive steps to stave off the influx of the virus in Ohio. We're pretty lucky to be in this state because we have a governor. And it's interesting because, I mean, he's a Republican, right? So it's whether somebody is, kind of traditionally a Democrat or a Republican, that's not quite so important as whether our leaders, Republican or Democrat, are listening to the epidemiologists and listening to the scientists and taking action in order to protect their citizens, instead of just ruling by instinct or by hunch, right? So I don't think it's going to be that much of a problem. Well, but this is what we're seeing in geographically in China, and this is what the virologists are pointing out is quite likely to happen in the United States, right? So, and Mike DeWine, our governor in Ohio, listened to the scientists and took action. So we're seeing less of a fallout in Ohio, mortality and hospitalization wise, because of DeWine's actions. Right? So yeah, credit where credit's due. Right?
Yeah, this is. I was going to say one of the kind of lesser known economic philosophers. I think Verbil had he followed Marx and kind of had an idea not of a proletariat revolution, but that he called it engineering revolution, where, and I think kind of in modern context it would be an expert revolution, where society is no longer ruled by kind of a ruling class or a class of businessmen and aristocrats, but of people who are experts in their field. And when something comes up that, when a viral pandemic comes up, the epidemiologists will take control and start, running the economy. So to respond to that, and, same thing with, meteorological or kind of any number of situations, they'll have the experts running each individual sector and kind of people who have expertise in that specific area running it, instead of, businessmen or aristocrats or politicians running it. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of the seeds of the, engineers revolution here with the governors who are listening to the epidemiologists and having better results than those who are just kind of going with their gut.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
It would make total sense for, the experts in their field to do what they've studied, to do what they're kind of, I don't want to say made to do, but what they've chosen to be an expert in. Why don't you let them do their work? I remember watching this video clip of Trump in a lab facility, and he's like, I have a hunch that this will all be gone. And I just, I don't want to defend Democrats because they can also be very sleazy, but there was a point when the stimulus bill was getting denied by the Democrats, and Trump said they were using this as a chance to get ahead. They were using this as a chance to get ahead of the Republicans and try and make it worse for the American citizens, when in reality, they were pushing for more economic relief. They didn't think the stimulus bill was enough. Yeah. But I found it so sad that the president was using this as a chance to get ahead, he was trying to show the Democrats not passing the stimulus bill as him being look, I'm trying to give you guys immediate relief. And the Democrats don't want that. They want to get ahead. It was
I think they were also pushing for more accountability for how the money is spent in the bill as well, as part of the
I think originally I saw something that there's supposed to be one guy in Trump's administration that would handle who got the money, and I don't remember any of the details, but it was basically Big Corp. Big Corp was going to get the money, and
and then we're not going to watch how they spend it.
yeah,
Really. Yeah.
we're not going to get the money. I mean, we're not.
I think,
College students aren't getting money anyway.
put it simply. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, sad.
Yeah. 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 Anyway, yeah. I try to be. Yeah. I don't know. I am here. Maybe I'll put out an anonymous survey or something like that. But I try my very best to cloak my political views in class, and sometimes I'm pretty successful at that, and sometimes I fail, right? in terms of, but the reason why I want to do that is because I just don't want. Sometimes people are very committed to a certain party or a certain political philosophy, and I don't want them to feel as though I want to sway the class in one direction or another. So I try to be as balanced as possible. But again, I can't possibly be as 100% successful with that. So yeah, if I ever end up leaning too far in one direction, I welcome corrections, right, and rebuke. Right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any final comments or thoughts or insights? This has been a very, very productive conversation. I've been really thankful for your contributions. But anything else we might want to add before we wrap it up?
Just a quick one on your last comment. So do you think, this is very off topic, sorry, you don't have to respond like at length, but do you think party lines do blind people's rational thinking? Like if you were just looking at a situation and ignoring party lines, objectively analyzing it, rationally analyzing it, you could come to the conclusion on both parties that they're irrational and doing things that don't make sense. But do you think people's support of that party blinds their rationality in part?
So I'll say two things. I'll preface this by saying that I do have fairly strong personal views that do align, personal and political views that do align much more with one party than with really any other party. I should say that. That being said, um, I also readily and openly admit that definitely the bias that you're describing is definitely there, right? And it seems unavoidable for people who are kind of more partisan, that like I am, right? So I admit that I'm partisan, right? And again, I don't want to disclose where I'm more affiliated, although you may have your suspicions. Either way. But yeah, I have to admit, there's plenty of bias to go around when we're thinking about party lines and party loyalties and commitments that interfere with our ability to look at situations objectively. And this is one of the reasons why, and this is something that I've made a topic of a lot of my own kind of research as somebody who's an academic and a philosopher, is how can we, given our biases, given what we think is the party that is going to do the best for America, the party that has the most integrity, the party that is has the most savvy in terms of how to run a country the best, and how to establish justice the most effectively, and so forth. Given those commitments, how then do we how do we kind of mitigate those biases? Right? How do we approach this situation such that we can recognize our party loyalties, and if we want to call them that, or recognize our affiliation with a certain party because they of shared values, say, but at the same time not be so persuaded and so loyal to that party that we sacrifice our sense of reason. Right? And this is why I think, and I've been grateful that a lot of people who are conventionally think like Democrats and affiliate themselves as Democrats are nevertheless acknowledging that the Republican leadership in the state has been, outstanding when it comes to the response to the coronavirus. Right. So, and there are some areas where some Republicans have recognized the success of Democrats. I think about, for example, some of the moments when well, specifically a moment when people were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, or otherwise known as Obamacare, and 3 key Senate Republicans decided, no, we're not going to repeal it. Right? One of them was John McCain, who would run for president against Barack Obama. So So yeah, there are ways and there are examples, there are cases where people have been able to kind of look past their biases and make the decision that is just best for human beings and that preserves human dignity the most. Yeah. Sorry, that was kind of a long-winded response and probably an incoherent response.
That was good. I got what you're saying. Yeah. It
Yeah.
is nice to see. Like, I know our governor in New York, Cuomo, recognized the Trump administration's actions for New York, at least, as being very helpful.
Yeah, the
And
governor of California too has acknowledged the efforts that are being made at the federal level now at this point. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry, Sean.
so it's nice to see that when people can put away like their party differences and actually, work to a better goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Great. Yeah, any other comments? Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion, right? Cool. Okay, good. So we'll wrap it up there. And that will also wrap up our discussions about Immanuel Kant. And I think what do we have next week? I'm not sure. I'll look at it real fast. Let's see. One of the things I'm looking forward to is when we talk about virtue ethics, because oh yeah, next week, yeah, feminism and the ethics of care, starting to get warmed up into virtue ethics. Great. So yeah, feminism and care. This is a really interesting, just as a brief warm up, and I know we're kind of over time now, but then again, all bets are off considering we're all quarantined, right? The ethics of care. So one of the things that we maybe haven't talked about a whole lot is the idea about well, just the whole idea, the word that we use very often, which is care. Right? Does that person even care, right? So the idea that morally we should care about something starts to it's a bit kind of abstract, right? Because what does it mean to care about something? There are a lot of different permutations for that word. But what it definitely does tap into is personality and character, right? And attitude towards other things. So as we start to talk about feminism and ethics of care and virtue, we're going to pivot a little bit from talking about principles and rules, and instead move a little bit more into talking about the heart in a sense. Anyway, so that's as a foreshadowing of next week. Right? Awesome. But thank you three so much for tuning in, and I will try to do one of these Zoom sessions again next week at class time, and it's been really fun. There's something a little bit kind of refreshing about the way that technology can provide for these kinds of get-togethers and sightings and meetings. Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, take care, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
I have a question real fast.
Yeah.
So you said the last one that I came in that we didn't have to do the discussion board, correct? If we
Right.
came to okay, I just
That's
wanted
right.
to make I missed the last one and I didn't know. I just didn't want to miss out on anything.
Oh yeah, no worries. Yeah, no, if you participate in our Zoom discussions, which again are optional, then you don't need to participate in the online discussion forums, right?
Okay.
So yeah, it's in other words, either one of the or the other, right? Either because I mean Zoom kind of does simulate class discussion anyway, which is what the online discussion is supposed to take the place of. Yeah, cool. Good question, Anna.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. I'll see you all next week. All right, take care.